Okay, just get started, I think. First of all, welcome everyone to the first in the Knowledge Exchange and Impact training sessions from the SCCJR. Today we're going to be talking about how to communicate with policy audiences. So we're delighted to welcome Amy Wilson, who's the Head of Justice Analytical Services, and Nick Bibby, who's the Director of the Scottish Policy and Research Exchange. So thanks very much, guys, for coming along. I'm going to pass over to Amy now. Let me just share your slides, Amy, and you can let me know when to move on, if that's okay.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Amy Wilson. I'm Head of Justice Analytical Services at the Scottish Government. And I'm delighted to be along today to take part in this event about how to communicate effectively with policy audiences. And I would say right at the start that you know, as I talk about this here, my experience is as a member of the Scottish Government, and I'm well aware, obviously, the fact that, you know, policy extends much beyond the Scottish Government. But I hope that the comments that I'll make today, just in this introductory bit, have got kind of wider resonance anyway, rather than just the narrow focus within the Scottish Government. So a little bit of background about myself. As I say, I head up Justice Analytical Services in the Scottish Government. I'm a statistician by background, and there's about 40 analysts in Justice Analytical Services, statisticians, economists, social researchers, and operational researchers. And we proudly wear our badge of being analysts. And indeed, I've been accused on many occasions of being too much of an analyst, which I think, well, mea culpa. But I would say that to kind of contrast with the policy people. So if we just move on to the next slide, Karen, who are the policy people within Scottish Government and what do they do? Well, you know, I may joke, but we do actually say sometimes within Jazz and other analysts that policy is the dark side, and sadly, I don't think they've got cookies either. But it can often be a kind of, I suppose, a caricature that we categorize the policy people and the analytical people as if somehow we've got the kind of purity in terms of, you know, we stick with the facts and the policy people are not interested in the facts and evidence. And indeed, I recently said in a meeting, and I think my policy colleagues were very offended, that something that we had written was based on the evidence and not on policy speak. And it's true. I mean, many of our policy colleagues, actually, many of my policy colleagues have come from an analytical background, and they really understand policy, so they really understand evidence, but they're coming at things from a different side. And from a different place. So moving on to the next slide, I just thought it was worth reminding ourselves. Now, I don't know how old you all are and whether you recognise any of these people here, but I think Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, and indeed in the thick of it, have a probably timeless appeal. So just thinking about in kind of civil service speaking in the Scottish Government, who are the policy people? Well, the person on the left-hand side of my screen, who's Jim Hacker, the hapless minister and then Prime Minister, you know, they're the people who make the who say what's going to happen. And the person in the middle, Malcolm Tucker, from in the thick of it, is the special advisor. They're looking at kind of how things play out and often actually thinking about what it is we need to do. But actually, in terms of policy, we're more like the exalted Sir Humphrey on the right-hand side, the civil servants who are actually tasked with taking what the ministers want to do and offering them the best way of implementing that. So we're looking at actually what's the most effective, what's the most cost effective, what's the simplest and the best way to achieve what ministers want to do. And that's what policy makers are about. They're actually looking at taking the political desires and making sure that we can actually implement them. So, you know, they're often looking at what's going to give the biggest bang for the buck, what's going to get the best outcome. And I think that's where the evidence really comes in. So we move on to the next slide. You know, in terms of my teams and what we're doing in evidence, but then in evidence more broadly, how can evidence help with policy making? Well, it helps identify issues which might require a policy response. So, for example, does the evidence tell us that there's a problem and tell us that there's some place we can make a difference? And a lot of the work that my teams do are working with the evidence and actually showing our policy colleagues either in relation to a policy they're already thinking about or where they might be looking at something, or indeed where they're not even thinking about something, but we know that there's an issue in which we're actually showing them on the basis of the evidence that there's a problem or that there's something that could be done to make a difference. Another thing that the evidence can do is help understand whether particular ideas is likely to achieve objectives, because often when there's a problem or something which a minister would like to do, there's different ways of going about doing that. And the evidence can really help us see whether or not we're going to actually achieve the objective that they want to achieve. The evidence helps us assess the impact a policy may have in different groups or businesses. So, for example, on different equality groups, on the environment. And we're often looking at that, understanding about differential impacts that a particular policy response may have on the basis of the evidence. A big one that myself and my teams use evidence for when working with our policy colleagues is challenging myths and assumptions. There's a huge amount, we all do, we carry ideas and views that we've either heard from other people, that we've read about, and often I find these things really gain traction, and the evidence can really help us challenge the myths and assumptions. One of the most interesting ones I found in my kind of world, if I ask my family, friends, people I know, how many homicides do you think there are in Scotland every year? Then people seem to have a very, very different view from the reality. Now, the reality was last year, I'll probably get this wrong, it was either 56 or 58 in Scotland last year. But I don't know whether it's because of the kind of history of programmes like Taggart and more recently Shetland and all the other ones that people think that there's thousands of homicides in Scotland every year. But, when you really start to say that's not for a moment to suggest that each one is not important and impactful and terrible, but actually, again, the reality can be quite different from what people think is the case. Another important thing around evidence, I think, is around making policies more resilient to challenge. So it's really important when policies are challenged, whether it's by, in the case of government, by opposition parties or indeed by anybody else, that there's a real basis we can point to as to why policies were developed. What was the evidence on which they were developed? And finally, the last one I've got here is around evaluating whether policies are working or not. And that's a really important thing, because at the end of the day, we need to understand whether or not the things that people are doing are actually having the intended outcome. And if they're not, what does the evidence tell us about why not? So just really to finish up in terms of my last slide, if we just move on, really bringing us to the point of today. And as I say, I've been talking about this within a context of government policy, but I think the points are more general. You are all producers of incredibly rich evidence, which is very, very valuable and absolutely essential to developing good policy, because good policy starts with good evidence. But what we need to ensure within a public policy context is that the policy makers are aware of the evidence and understand how they can use it. So just very quickly, here's my 5 top tips for how you communicate effectively. The first one I would say is methods matter, but findings matter more. Methods matter to me, and I found myself in meetings kind of getting quite hot under the collar sometimes with policy colleagues about how we've done things and why they can't say some of the things that they want to say, and why the design matters. Yes, it does matter, but actually ultimately for them the findings matter more. The second one is possibly the one I would say is the most important, the kind of so what question, because I find it fascinating reading evidence reviews, evidence papers. Actually, so do many of my policy colleagues, but ultimately it's what difference does this make? What should I take from this, and why should it matter to me is what the policy person will be wanting to know. The third top tip is probably about understanding your audience. So when you're writing, how much can you assume that they know about the background? And can you present things in ways that they will understand and see the relevance? Often, actually, people do know a huge amount of the background, particularly if they've been working in the area for a long time. And often as well, people are pushed for times. I find my policy colleagues love executive summaries, because then they can see right at a glance, are there important things for them that they need to understand? And then they can go back and look more. My fourth top tip is a picture tells 1,000 words. Now, that's not to suggest for a moment everything needs to be presented in pictures, but innovative ways in getting information across can often be really, really impactful. We do an awful lot more now, obviously, around data visualizations and around graphics, but just thinking about actually, are there different ways? And we've seen some fabulously innovative stuff, I think, over the last few years in the justice sphere in terms of how people have managed to communicate with audiences. And my last thing, I think, around making sure that we use evidence in the most impactful way is about being clear, concise, and logical, which obviously comes very easily to all of us analysts. But I think our policy colleagues as well love it when we're clear and we're concise and when there's a logic to what we're saying. So I really hope that just provides a very short kind of insight into the world that I work in and what we're doing when we're using evidence and working with policy. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Nick and from yourselves today and to participate in that discussion about how we can make sure that the great evidence that you guys produce is presented in the most impactful way and communicated to policy colleagues. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, Nick, if you're okay to go, that's great.
You would have thought after 2 years of this, I'd have mastered the mute button. Thank you, Amy. It was great actually sitting through your presentation, and whenever I'm alongside someone from government, particularly if I've already prepared my slides, I have this slight trepidation because they're going to say something that will mean, oh my God, everything I was going to say is wrong, but we're fine. So it's reassuring. So what I'm planning to do, I know Amy needs to shoot off at 11, so I'm going to split my presentation a little and just take the first two slides first, because one of the key things to take away from this is that second point that Amy was making in the final slide. Yeah. So what? Why does this matter? What does this speak to? Why does a busy analyst or policymaker need to know about this and needs to know about this now? So I'm going to, the rest of my presentation will be about some of the communication tools you might use. I'm going to start off with a little focus on the importance of identifying a policy question. So rather than starting off with, I finished this piece of research, I've been working on it for 3 years, it's the most important thing in the world, everyone must know about it. Instead, thinking things through in terms of what are live policy questions at the moment, where might you look for those, and how might your research inform those discussions. So let me just bring up a few. I should also say, by the way, we'll have some breakout groups in a bit, and thinking about what a policy question might be is going to be the discussion I ask you to have in those groups. So you can fall asleep after these slides, but for this particular bit, it's useful to have a look. If I can just do that, okay. There we go. Can everyone see that? Okay. Cool. So, as I say, the second half of my presentation will be about picking tools, and I'm going to look at two tools in particular. A quite commonly used document called a policy brief, and I'm also going to look at how you might use blogs to catch somebody's attention, perhaps if you've got some work that's about a new topic or something they might be familiar with. So a few questions just to think about at the beginning of this process. And hopefully there's nothing too convoluted here. You would do this, I would say, in any communication. So this applies to engaging with a policy audience, but also applies to engaging with any other audience. I used to say any other non-academic audience. That's actually not true. It applies to an academic audience as well. It's just that other academics do this so automatically they don't have to think about the process. But when you're talking to audiences with a different professional background, it's useful to think this through. So the first question is, who is your audience? Who are you talking to? and think we'll unpick this a bit more in a bit, but think through their needs. How do they operate? What are they getting out of this? Yeah, so how do they learn is a key question you might address them. I think there's one of the ones further down. What is your message? What are you actually trying to say? What is the point you're trying to do? Often when you're engaging with government, you're asking the question, what do I want them to do differently? I'm giving them this information, what should change? It's not just about being interesting. So what does your audience know now? What are the underlying assumptions that they're working on? What's the challenges that they're facing? What would they have done if you hadn't intervened? What do you want them to know, or what do you want them to do? Yeah, so you need to address those 4 questions kind of in pairs. Yeah, audience and message, message and audience. When you're communicating anything, you go back and forth between those 2 all the time. And you want to be as precise as possible with both of those. There's a bit of a tendency to say, oh, my audience is all stakeholders, policymakers, the third sector, business, the general public. No. Be as precise as you possibly can. And not even just a policy audience. Are you talking to analysts? Are you talking to people on a policy team? Are you speaking to opposition politicians? Who's your audience? And the final question then is, how does your audience learn? So that will help you think in terms of the tools that you might use. Okay, so those are 5 questions you might use for addressing the tools. That picture, by the way, is not an impact communication tool. It's the Honours of Scotland, which was presented to the Scottish Parliament by the Queen in 1999. So a key question you're going to want to address when you're approaching this is, what's the question that you're answering? Yeah, so how does your research relate to a live policy topic at the moment? So often it may be something that people are unaware of, and you're addressing something and bringing it to light. That's absolutely fine. But by far and away, the quickest route in, if you're looking for a quick route to impact, is to look for something that you know government's working on at the moment. So there's a number of places that you might look for policy questions and might look for things to address. But as a general principle, you're looking around at various documents and sources of questions. So you might look at, for example, discussions in the media. You might speak to NGOs who are very good at kind of second guessing what's coming down the line. What's government going to be looking at in 6 months' time? You might, of course, just speak to officials directly, is another way of finding them. Looking at the manifestos of political parties from the previous or forthcoming elections is another useful way to see what issues are live at the moment. You could also look at both the programme for government and the budget, which are produced by the Scottish Government, but similar documents are produced by other agencies. And that, again, will give you a sense of, well, what can I address? And then you think in terms of, how does my research speak to that? One of the questions I'm asked most often by policy professionals is that they're looking for people who can give them overviews of existing knowledge, rather than necessarily saying, here's the findings of one survey or one study, interesting though that is. So often it's a case of bringing together a body of knowledge and applying it to a question. The final thing I'll say on this topic is the defining aspect of a policy question rather than a research question is that the answers to it can be implemented. Yeah? So that thing Amy was just saying about taking political ideas and working out how to make them work. Yeah? That's what policy is about. It's about making things happen in the world and in this particular bit of the world. Yeah? So it has to be able to operate within Scotland. If you're engaging with Scottish Government, any proposals you make need to be within the competencies of the Scottish Government, and in practice as well as in theory. So there's all sorts of lists of what are referred to as devolved and reserved competencies. So the different powers of the 2 governments with responsibility for Scotland, the UK and the Scottish Government. But then there's also different authorities, yeah? So interactions with local authorities, with various public agencies. So when you're connecting with any policymaking body, you need to relate to their patch, their bit of geography that you're dealing with, their areas of responsibility, and they also need to have power to do something about it. One final point, just in terms of any proposals you might make, there's quite a nice short video on our website, I think. I'll send you the Vimeo link. There's an interview with Amy's colleague, Audrey McDougall, and she's talking about, what issues should you address if you want to engage with Scottish Government? Well, they've got to be able to do it. So anything you're suggesting has to be legal, it has to be affordable, it has to be politically viable, and it has to be in line with the broad direction of government policy. So if you want to catch the attention of government, those are some things to think about. I say I'm going to take this presentation on in a moment and have a look at some of the tools that you might use to engage with government. But I wanted to pause there and just take any initial questions while Amy's still here as well, about that idea of how you can frame your research so that it speaks directly to questions that government might have. And Amy, you should absolutely feel free to shoot me down at this point if I'm speaking utter nonsense. So, Amy, could you say a bit perhaps about sort of perhaps sources of policy questions? So often people who are approaching engaging with policy for the first time simply aren't quite sure where to start. What does government want to know? Can they just email an analyst and say, I'm working on this? Can they, should they look at what's on the front page of the Daily Record? Where's a good place to start finding ministers and want to know?
Yeah, so I probably wouldn't necessarily start on the front page of the Daily Record or the Daily Mail, indeed, for that. But no, I mean, certainly, for example, within the justice sphere, we would always be very happy at JAS to hear from anybody who's got any questions, and we can certainly point you in the right direction, because I appreciate it's difficult. To be honest, it's sometimes difficult even for us working in government to know who's working on particular areas, but we would always be very happy to help. In terms of kind of, I suppose, an articulation of some of the live questions which we've just published. I think some of you will maybe know, if you working on justice issues, we just published a new justice vision and strategy, which is high level, but there's a lot of evidence sitting behind that, and it gives a good idea, I think, of the kind of areas that we're interested in. We've got 5 high-level aims, one of which is around recovery from COVID, which is maybe slightly off to the side in terms of how the systems recover. But at a very high level, we're very interested in how do we keep safe communities safe now and in the future. So there's a lot of stuff around all issues around community safety. Prevention and early interventions is a massive thing for us. And I think it's something we feel we haven't done enough on. How do we reform our justice services? And we're talking not just criminal, but civil justice services as well, to make them more kind of person-centered, trauma-informed, to really meet the needs of the 21st century. And I think, a lot of these issues, we have ideas, but understanding what the research tells us, how do we make this? Because one of the principles that we have said in our new justice strategies, it should be evidence-based. So really understanding, what does the latest evidence tell us around some of these questions, some of these areas. And the last one is around shifting the balance between custody and community sentences. So these are really broad areas which probably give you a good idea about some of the big areas that we're interested in. And the other kind of thing that I would say as well is, if you look at some of the publications we've done in the past around what works to reduce reoffending, what works to reduce crime, where now they need updated, but actually almost that question in your head, looking at some of the areas of the justice strategy, what works to improve community safety, what works in terms of prevention and early intervention, that, kind of framing your questions in that way and thinking through that lens, I think would be really helpful. And then obviously there's a whole kind of, as Nick said, there's the programme for government, there's the manifesto commitments, but I think certainly within the justice sphere, the justice strategy really gives a good articulation, I think, about where our head is at collectively and what are the areas we really want to focus on going forward.
Very much. Does anyone have any sort of particular questions just on this topic of how you might identify what government wants to know, or indeed what any other policy actor wants to know? Deafening silence, which I shall take as proof of the brilliance of our summaries so far, and that we've answered every conceivable question. That topic for now, and I will plough on with my presentation. But if a question occurs to you, please do use the chat function, either to ask it generally to the group so they can all see it, or directly to either Amy or I. But for now, I will continue. So as I mentioned, it is about thinking about implementation. How could this be implemented? Now, it's absolutely not your job to create policy. It's not your job to address all of these questions, but it is worth being aware of the fact that that's how this knowledge is going to be used. And it's what an audience is looking for. Yeah? So I have this at the back of your mind as you're looking through this. I'm going to speak quickly to this slide. There's a lot of text on it, and it's more about sort of communications theory than anything else, to be honest. But you have a number of issues, which I mentioned 2 slides ago, that you want to try and address whenever you're thinking about how you might connect with policymakers. Just say the first of these is your message, and it's working as precise as possible about this. What is it that you're trying to say? Why does it matter? Why does it matter now? And be as precise as you can be on how this relates to current policy questions or topics. And now, we all do that thing, or certainly I'm guilty of doing that thing, where I just start writing. Yeah, and that's fine. That's a good way of helping us think. But having written, you should then go back and think, what precisely am I saying here? And working with colleagues can be a great way to tease that out. Similarly, with your audience, who are you writing for? We instinctively write for ourselves, or we write for audiences with whom we're very familiar. You're not here writing for an academic audience, you're writing for a very particular audience. And insofar as it's possible, I would tend to have an individual in mind. Yeah, so it might well actually be that Amy is the individual you're thinking of. She's head of Justice Analytics. And so you're couching what you're saying in terms of things that would be useful for her. Now, in practice, it may be read by other people as well, but it's often useful to be thinking about an individual. What do they need? What are they looking for from this? And you go back and forth between those two things. Who your audience is helps you refine the message. What do they need to know? What the message is helps you think about the audience. How do I package this so that they will be able to use this information? And it's only when you've refined those two that you can think about in terms of what medium you're using. I say, don't worry too much about the massive text on this slide. But the medium comes out of those two things. There's a real tendency when academics want to engage with non-academic audiences to try and broadcast on all frequencies, yeah, and to say, oh, we should put together a report, we should have a podcast, we need a Facebook page, we should set up a Twitter account, we should put out a press release. It's like, no. Think about who it is you're engaging with, and if you're wanting, in this instance, for example, to work with policymakers, and actually, shouting about it in the press might not be a good way to get their attention. Amy's absolutely right. Doing things that are easy to digest, using infographics, using various solutions that catch someone's attention is great, but then think about how this knowledge is going to be used. It's going to be conveyed to others within government. So you need to highlight what's important within this. So there are some tools you can use to do so. So obviously we live in an information-rich world. There are a huge number of communication tools that you have at your disposal, and unusually, we now probably have too many to choose from. And there was a time where the choice was pretty much a meeting or a report, and those are still very good choices. It's very easy to rush off and assume that we need to do something terribly, terribly creative. You know, it's like, oh, let's have a pop-up musical performance in St Andrew's Square. That will get everyone's attention. Well, it will, and then they'll go back to the desk and get on with their job. So think in terms of how they absorb information and how they do it at work. You're connecting with them as professionals, not just as citizens. So a good starting point is to think in terms of what's working for. How do people standardly receive information? And is it possible to package what you're saying within those forms? It really frustrates me actually when I'm talking to, I have to say, particularly senior academics of a certain type, who will say things like, oh, they should just read my latest book. So, well, that's great, but they're probably not going to. So think in terms of how people acquire information and accept the fact that nothing is perfect. There's always a balance in any communication tool between how you want to say something and how people want to receive it. So you might well want to use a 300-page book. They might want to use a one-page infographic. There's probably a happy compromise somewhere between those two, but insisting on using one particular form is unlikely to work. So be aware that all communications tools are a compromise between the author and the audience. Finally, start small. People can come back and ask you for more information. The objective, certainly in any initial contact with a policy or other audience, is to get their attention and allow them to see why this matters to them and why they should be interested. If they are interested, they'll come back and ask for more information. It's a bit like a CV. When you send in a CV, the objective is to get to the interview. Right? It's not to convey every thought you've ever had on the subject. Right? So start small, be concise, be accessible, and then people can come back and say, well, what did you mean by that? Do you have any more information about this? That's fine. So I'm going to look very quickly about two tools you might want to use. We could easily speak for 2 hours about either of these, so this is very much a rush through, but it will give you a feel for them. Blogging is a really useful way of getting people's attention. It's become a sort of standard academic tool. One thing I think Scottish Government is very good at is connecting with the kind of key hubs on a particular topic. So, for example, your own centre, but also the Scottish Drugs Research Network, or the Centre on Constitutional Change, or the Fraser of Allender Institute. It's good at identifying, or this is the key research hub working on a given topic. So often those have blogs, and it's a good place to connect. It's a good way of getting people's attention. But there's no such thing as one individual blog post. When you're developing an engagement strategy, it's not about writing one seminal blog. It's about putting it in a place where people will notice that it exists. So whether you're looking to build a blog site from scratch, or you're looking for a site where you can post, you're looking for somewhere that has a proven track record of relevancy. I'll come on to this in a minute. But the reputation is built up over time. So in practical terms, that means somewhere that is updated relatively frequently. So say a new post a week, something like that. Clarity, absolutely what Amy said in her final slide there. As much as possible, avoid jargon or explain it. Avoid geekery. Please don't bang on about methodology all the time. I edit a lot of academic blogs. and the number of them that spend the first 7 paragraphs talking about methodology and the final paragraph talking about their findings, talk about what this is not about, what we're not finding. So this is great. What did you find out? So always start off with findings. Bear in mind that, of course, somebody may have been working on this topic for 10 years. They may also have been in post for 3 weeks. So you're writing for an intelligent lay audience who understands the issue and understands the pressures on policy, but may not be familiar with the literature. And finally, relevance. There is a real tendency so when I first set up Spree, I put a blog on the website, and I thought this is going to be great. I'll just hoover up policy relevant blogs from academic research centres, and that will be me. That will be my job. It will be very straightforward. So I followed about 100 academic blog sites. Overwhelmingly, they posted about successes in securing funding, that their director had just been appointed a fellow of this, that, the other, that so-and-so had just completed their PhD, all sorts of internal news, but news that was of interest to a very particular audience. If you're trying to engage with policy, post about policy, just that, build a reputation, become the blog that people need to go to on a weekly basis to keep abreast of current developments in evidence. Similarly, if you're wanting to engage with industry, post about implications for industry and nothing else. If you want to engage with a third sector, you can fill in the rest. The other thing I want to look at is a very common tool in policy engagement, which is the policy brief. There are other similar tools. You'll sometimes hear people talk about research briefs. Research briefs tend not to make recommendations. Policy briefs tend to make recommendations. There are no absolute rules in this space. So you use the tool and adapt it to the message that you're trying to make. But just to run through a few tips about this. So a policy brief is a short document. Generally, I tend not to just make it running text. So design it a bit, and that allows you to put in little sort of black boxes with information and so on. But it's usually 2 to 4 pages long. It's written in a professional style. It's easy to understand. I've said there without specialized knowledge. I don't actually quite mean that. But it's easy to understand without a particular academic knowledge. Yeah? So again, remember that you are dealing with professionals, but their expertise may lie in other areas, and their expertise may lie more in implementation than in research itself. It focuses on policy. It will address a particular policy question, and it may well make recommendations that are implementable within the reader's context. Yeah? So that comes back to that bit about thinking through what are the powers of the organisation that you're connecting with, and what do you want them to do. And the final thing is that they're evidence-based. So quite a common error in writing policy briefs is that people present a body of evidence, either from a particular study or from a wider body of knowledge, and then go on to make recommendations that have nothing to do with that evidence at all. So as far as possible, you want to link any recommendations you make specifically to a point in the evidence that you're drawing out from the research. Yeah, so the closer you can connect those, the better. It's not about saying, oh, here's some research findings, and here's some things I think we should generally do about this. You connect the one to the other. So what does that look like in practice? You will have at the top an executive summary. It'll be about 10% of the total length. In practice, that means a couple of hundred words. Generally speaking, always write your exec summary last. So you've worked through the rest of the document. You know exactly what it says. The executive summary is an introduction to the document. Right? It will review what's said in the document itself and allow the reader to understand why it's important to read the rest of it. I've actually seen a thing on a couple of things now where you have a little toolbox at the top, the brief in brief, which just says all of that in a sentence. You know, what's this about? why does it matter? Which I thought was quite a neat trick. Let's see. Executive summary introduces the document. The introduction introduces the topic. So here is why you say that something matters. And I like to think that, a good introduction creates a sense of curiosity. By the time I finish reading it, and this is, exec summary, introduction, and we know more than halfway down the first side. But by that point, really, really want to know what the thing is. Methodology, there should be a section on methodology. It is of interest, but it's of limited interest. So keep it short, no more than 5 to 10% of the overall, and erring on the side of 5%, to be honest. So you then get into the real sort of meat of the matter, findings and conclusions. This is a bit that everyone's interested in, to be honest. So if you're looking for where to spend the most time, spend it here. This should be sparklingly clear, if at all possible, and should also, everything that you put in here, think back to how does this relate? How does this relate to the question we're asking? By the time they finish this, it should be relatively clear where you're going to go with your recommendations. I'd say your recommendations should speak directly to the evidence. So to take an example from another field, if the evidence suggests that more walking and cycling is good for public health, then the recommendation is going to be, therefore, local authorities should build more walking paths and cycle paths. So your recommendations and your conclusions should speak to each other directly. And essentially, just reiterated that in that section. Don't recommend the overhaul of global capitalism. I mean, the more modest and applicable your recommendations will be, the more likely you are to succeed in terms of how they impact. And then finally, have a references and further resources section. It's not an exhaustive bibliography. So by all means, if this is a policy brief coming out from a particular study and you've published that study somewhere, then of course reference the published study. If there are key works that you want to refer to, do that as well. But this might also be where you list your blog, or you give a link to a YouTube lecture you've given on it, or whatever else. Yeah, here you can put in things that you just think are useful for the reader. They don't need to necessarily be a bibliography for what you said exclusively. You want some of that. I'm just going to finish with this slide. I'll send these around. I'm not going to go through this, but bear in mind that the objective here really is developing a relationship. So there is exhaustive research on a relatively limited impact that any one interaction will have. I remember talking to an impact assessor on a REF panel a few years ago, and he said, you can tell immediately the impact statements that you can just throw away because they're the ones that start. We wrote this study and the law was changed, and he said that's just not how policy works. So be aware of what's achievable. Be aware that this is about building a relationship over time. Think about your audience, and so on. I say I'll send these around. I think that's all I want to say for now. Sorry, Karen, I've only just seen your comment. I've seen that I was cutting out a bit. I'm sorry. I hope some of what I was saying at least got across. Are there any questions, first of all, either on what I've said or what Amy said? What's the example of kind of great practice in this area?
I mean, no, not at all. I think a lot of that, I think you've covered a huge amount of it. But then the other thing I would probably say is I wouldn't underestimate the fact that we just don't necessarily see things. And I think there's a real, one of my big frustrations, and I, in fact, Nick mentioned Audrey McDougall, who's the chief social researcher. She and I were talking about this, that I feel there's a huge amount of research that's done, fantastic research that's being done, and we just don't see it. And that may be, to be fair, because we're not looking for it, but also it's just the reality. You know, if I'm not saying this to make anybody feel sorry for me, but if I look at my diary yesterday, I was in meetings from 8:30 in the morning to 5 o'clock. Pretty much, I think I had about 15 minutes for lunch. The chances of actually having time, you know, just even catching up with my inbox at that point in time is hard enough. And to have the time to look, which I wish we did have more. But I think what I would say is, you know, communicate, and don't be shy about getting in touch with us. Don't feel, it may feel, I don't know what it feels like actually for yourselves looking in at government, that, you know, we wouldn't be interested. We will be interested in what you're doing. We might not necessarily be able to respond or use it in a particular way, but actually knowing the research that's going on out there is incredibly helpful. So please get in touch. And, you know, if you're interested in talking about, you know, what areas we're working on, again, helping to kind of define some of those policy questions. Certainly my colleagues in Jazz are probably a good intermediary with the policy people. So, you know, I think everything that Nick is saying is incredibly helpful, and it's incredibly helpful for us as well to be able to read blogs, to read short policy briefs and things, because there's a really good idea of what's out there, and then we can follow up more. And just, you know, don't think that if we're not getting in touch or we haven't responded, it's because we're not interested. Sorry, I should say, yeah, Justice Analytical Services, Jazz. Sadly, not jazz in the musical sense, jazz in the. But yeah, it's not that we're not interested. It might just be we've not had a chance to really pick it up, and we do want to make sure that we are aware of the research that's being done and that we can make better use of it.
So just to follow up on that, one of the questions I'm asked most frequently by researchers is, when should I connect? Yeah, when in the sort of lifetime of a piece of work should I get in touch? The answer is always now. Yeah, I mean, there is nothing at all to stop you connecting with someone like Amy and saying, you know, we're at the start of a study. You know, this is a 3-year study, but, you know, I'd like to come and talk to you and let you know what we're going to be doing, what's going to be happening in this space. The most frustrating thing for policymakers and other external audiences is when people, you know, we've got a thing on the website that talks about the professor of cabbages contacting the clerk to the Scottish Parliament's Fruit and Vegetables Committee with her research on relationships between brassicas and poverty. And so we've just completed this 5-year study. The clerk said, well, that's great, but unfortunately the brassicas alleviation of poverty brackets Scotland bill just passed 3 months ago, and we won't touch this issue again for 10 years. So it's always worth flagging up. This is going on. Government might want it, they might not. Unfortunately, whatever the demands for REF, there is quite a lot of luck in this field. You know, I mean, anyone who, for example, was working on novel coronaviruses 3 years ago would probably have struggled to get a hearing in government. You better believe they wanted to talk to you a year and a half ago, though. You know, so this does change. You know, I talk about getting ahead of the game and looking at what's coming up in 6 months' time. Government is dominated by events. Things come up and people need a response now. But that means it's really useful to know what's going on in the world. You know, oh, that person I had coffee with 3 months ago, they were working on this. I can go and talk to them. Cool. I've burbled on a bit, and I'm conscious that people might be needing a bit of a break. If there are no questions at this point, I'm going to suggest that we break for 5 minutes. And is 5 minutes long enough? If people need longer, let me know. And then we come back, and I say there's a short breakout exercise, and then just an opportunity for questions and discussion after.
So we have a session every week where we all get together, which has actually been made much easier by doing it online. One of the great things has been having presentations from others. It's called Jazz at 3. A very, you know, if you fancy as well, if you're doing research and even at an early stage and you just want to talk about what you're doing, I can guarantee there's a bunch of analysts who would be thrilled to listen to what you're doing. So, you know, if you ever want to just have a bit of a exposure of what you're working on, please do get in touch, and you can come along and do something internal for us. And quite often that then has led, when we've done things with other researchers, it's then led to me to think, yeah, that'd be really good to get a bunch of policy people. So, you know, please, as I say, feel free to get in touch, use us as conduits as well, and we can help try and make sure, as Nick says, that even if it's not the time at the moment, we'll be aware of what you're doing, so that if in 6 months' time something's coming along, we know exactly who's working on what issues and can put the policy teams in touch. So, as I say, do feel free to get in touch with me anytime, or any of my colleagues within JAS, and we'll make sure that we share contact details.
So much, Amy. Thank you so much for coming along as well, and thanks, Nick, for that.